Hi, everybody. My name is Miles, and I'm a disability inclusion partner for Peak Performers. Every once in a while, I have interviews over the course of my career that really changed the way that I think about things. And I'm so excited to bring back onto my new program, Disability Idea, Karin Boxer. Now, Karin, I met actually at a roundtable a little while back when I was over in Richmond, Virginia. And she had such a unique and interesting perspective to offer in regards to particularly the accommodations process and how to add a little bit more structure to that. So without any further ado, I want to welcome Karin on to be talking with me. Karin, thanks so much for jumping on today.
Thanks, Miles. Thanks for having me.
Well, Karin, if you wouldn't mind, please introduce yourself for the audience and give us a brief recap of your story.
So first let me give a visual description of myself. So I am a middle-aged white woman with shoulder-length brown hair. I'm wearing a black button-down shirt with a collar, and I'm in my home office, and you can see a bookshelf behind me and some curtains. So I am an independent scholar, a consultant, and a speaker. But I spent 24 years as a philosophy professor before leaving academia after a failure to get workplace accommodations. And through that process, I decided, to look a little bit harder at, what was in my process. Because the interesting thing is there were accommodations that would have helped me, just no one ever suggested them. And I realized that there was a mismatch between the intentions of the ADA and the way most employers have operationalized the interactive process. And so I started writing and thinking about that and thinking about what are the structures that we could put in place to prevent cases like mine.
And as I mentioned previously, I've interviewed Karin previously for my previous segment called Disability Story. And she talked more extensively about her own experience with obsessive compulsive disorder, and particularly some of the different challenges that she had with kind of seeking out accommodations, which is why I wanted to bring you back on. So I guess if I just had to pitch the question to you of like, what's wrong with the accommodations process, Karin? Like, why should we be concerned about it? And what would you like to change?
Okay. Well, the reason we should be concerned about the accommodations process is that's the mechanism through which the ADA is meant to work in employment. So the way in which the ADA is meant to secure equal participation for people with disabilities in employment is by modifying the workplace where the workplace is using standards that accidentally exclude people with disabilities. So the question is, are the standards, are the policies, even if they're facially neutral, are they disproportionately disadvantaging people with disabilities? And if they are, then the ADA says you have to change those policies. The main problem I see with the ADA. So the ADA itself does not give a mechanism for seeking accommodations. It deferred that to the EEOC. And the EEOC did issue regulations. And what the regulations say is in some cases, it may be necessary to have an informal interactive process in order to identify reasonable accommodations. And so that's for cases where an accommodation is not obvious. And so it's meant to be a collaborative brainstorming between the employer and the employee, but really with the responsibility placed on the employer to find the correct accommodation. But the way in which it's often implemented is that to start the process, you have to fill out a form that asks you to identify what accommodation you're seeking, and also have a form from your medical provider that's recommending a particular accommodation and saying that that accommodation will be effective, which there's no way to know in advance. But the issue that I have with that is medical providers are experts at treating disabilities, at curing, at fixing. But the premise of the ADA is not to fix the worker, it's to fix the workplace. And so you're asking doctors, how do you alter the workplace to make them more accessible? And they just don't have the right expertise. right? We should be
There's a
consulting.
lot of other people out there that have that expertise, right? Like, you think about occupational therapists, ergonomists, I know that you've mentioned before, even people from vocational rehabilitation. Like, these are people that their entire professional vocation is adapting the workplace towards people with disabilities. And I couldn't agree with you more that doctors are sometimes like, I don't know, what is it that you need? And that can be really tough for us, right? Like, especially if we have a new disability accommodation need and we don't know what works for us exactly quite right yet.
Yeah, and I mean that was very much the situation with me. So in my case, I have just right OCD,
Mhm.
which is a form of OCD where something just doesn't feel right and you get obsessed with trying to fix it. And in my case, it affected my academic writing.
Mhm.
So I could write notes. I had hundreds of pages of ideas. When I went to finalize them in prose, I would either write the same sentence over and over again or put down 5 versions of the same sentence and then not be able to choose between them. And so when I told that to the dean, what I said is, look, I'm doing some of the best philosophy I have done in years. I'm loving teaching. I'm loving philosophy. I can't finalize prose.
Yeah.
And by the time I went to the dean, trying to finalize prose was actually making me suicidal.
Yeah.
And so the response was, well, let's seek accommodations. But when I asked for accommodations, the response was, well, we can't waive scholarship.
Mm.
And we kind of went back and forth, and I asked, well, what about this? Can I do this? Can I have an extra year on the tenure track? Can I take time out of the tenure track to get inpatient treatment? Um, you know, can I switch to a teaching only role?
Mm.
Um, and can you get me an editor who can help me eliminate multiple sentences from my prose so that we have like I had all the ideas, I just couldn't finalize it. And it was always, no, that's not a reasonable accommodation, but come back to us if you have a reasonable accommodation and we're willing to consider it.
Yeah.
And the problem is the employer controls what is reasonable.
Yeah.
They control workplace policies, they control flexibility. And they're really supposed to be a brainstorming partner. The person with a disability is supposed to say their limitation, how it's affecting their work. And then you're supposed to work with human resources to figure out, well, what accommodation would help. And in my case, that just didn't happen. And I mean, looking back at it, what I kept on saying to them, I can speak, but I can't write. So what they should have said is, so fine, go out and give talks, record them. That's scholarship. But they had such a narrow view of scholarship as it has to be in writing, that it didn't occur to me to ask for that as an accommodation. It didn't occur to them to offer it. And that would have saved my career.
And I'm so torn on this one too. By the way, before I get any further, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Stephanie Cawthon. Thanks for joining us live. If you are joining us live today, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment into the chat. Also, drop your own ideas as far as what you would like to see reformed within the ADA process. Now, what I'm a little bit torn with here, Karin, is that oftentimes the first piece of advice that I give to job seekers with disabilities is have an idea of what you need to be successful going into it. And that comes from pragmatism, right? Because I've seen so many of them where if they come to their employer and they request an accommodation, but they don't have a clear idea, it's much more likely to get declined, or it's much more likely that they're going to be treated differently within the workplace too. So the question that I have is, how much of that onus should be on the boss, the employer, versus how much of that should be on the individual, which theoretically anyway should know their body and their mind and their needs the best?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the individual does know their body and their minds, and they do know what's not working for them. What they don't know is what policies is the university or the employer willing to change. What technology is out there that the university can or employer can afford? What accommodations have been successful for other people in the past, right? So you may have familiarity with your disability, but have a new job duty that you're not sure what the accommodation will work with that. So, and I think one other important thing about this is that if you ask who has the resources to pay for an occupational rehab consultant or a workplace ergonomist. And the average cost of that is between $150 and $300 an hour. The employer is the one who has the resources to pay for that. And so I think in many cases, the employee will know what accommodation will help them. What they won't know is whether the employer will consider it reasonable or not. But in some cases, neither party will know. And that is the circumstance in which the interactive process is supposed to come into play, specifically when you need to identify the appropriate accommodation. And there, like, I think it does need to be cooperative, right? So if the employee is not willing to be frank about their limitations, if they're not willing to consider different options, that's on the employee. But really, the employer does have to be an equal partner in this process. And I think when it comes to bringing in outside expertise, if necessary, the person's doctor is not the right person to bring in. It would be a workplace ergonomist or an occupational therapist or an assistive technology specialist, and it really should be the employer is the one who has the resources, and $300 is not an undue burden.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And particularly many of the accommodations they'll come up with would be free. So it would have been free for them to say, give talks, right? Another thing that would have worked for me, so they gave me dictation software, and I told them the problem wasn't, it wasn't working for me because the problem was knowing I was composing. So it wasn't typing per se, it was knowing I was composing. So with voice dictation, I know I'm composing, but I can spontaneously talk about my ideas. They could have given me a student research assistant, right? Who I could have spoke out my ideas to, recorded them. The person wouldn't even have had to just transcribe them. It would have been a great experience for the student, a great experience for me. Just, there was no brainstorming. There was just this narrow range of, we've never done that before. But we do give people dictation software. So let's give you some dictation software. And when that didn't work, it was just, well, I guess you don't belong here.
One of the things, thank you for sharing that, by the way. One of the things that I struggle with a little bit on this as well is I'm a board game designer on the side. And I know from many hard-won experience that the single thing that players hate to do the most is they hate to read the rules. And this is consistent. Like, there is nothing in my world and my hobby that is more loathed universally than doing what's called a blind play test, where you hand players the rule book and then the game, and then they set up and play it and you watch it silently. And I feel like that generally is something that applies to the disability accommodation process. First off, I think it's important to acknowledge that if you'd go to any random Joe on the street, most of them have no concept of how to go about the disability accommodation process. They don't really have a full understanding of what a disability is, and they don't really know how the law applies to them. And so I'm just trying to imagine a circumstance where you go to some random Joe on the street and say, okay, here's the ADA accommodations process, and then we also want to add some more rules and some more structure into this. So I guess, like, how do we make this so that something with more structure also is a little bit more accessible to people that don't live in this world quite as much as we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things. I mean, so one thing that I am advocating, and I just completed a law review article with an employment lawyer arguing for this, is that the EEOC needs to issue better regulations. So interestingly, after the regulations were promulgated, the federal government kept on getting sued for failure to accommodate. And so there was an executive order to the EEOC that they had to issue better guidelines for federal agencies. And so the guidelines for regular employers, I think they're 4 pages. The guidelines for agencies are 40 pages, right? So they're just a lot more details. And quite a few of the points that we make in the law review article, they are things that the EEOC does clarify in that guidance, but not in the public guidance. So for instance, it says stuff such as Some employers believe that if the employee has proposed an accommodation that is not reasonable, they can just say no and the process ends there.
Mm.
And they officially say in this, that is a mistake.
Yeah.
If the accommodation proposed isn't reasonable, you have an obligation to do research, and the process needs to keep going at that point. It doesn't end. That's like a first step. There's no such clarification in the public guidance. Similarly, it says, best practice. If you do not know the appropriate accommodation, consult with the appropriate expertise. Here's a list of experts. The type of experts you might want to consult. Doesn't appear in the public, right? So I think a huge way to improve things would be for the EEOC to issue the same regulations to the public that they issue to federal agencies.
Mm.
I'm not sure the ordinary person on the street needs to know what the accommodations process is. I mean, that
Yeah.
is one thing. I do also think that when employers onboard employees, they should talk about the interactive process. They should say they are willing to give
Agreed.
accommodations, that accommodations are productivity tools and they're invested in their employees' productivity. And they should encourage their employees to come and request accommodations. And I think they should also periodically remind people of that. So say if you have to do an annual report, one category on the annual report could be, are there any accommodations that you think you need? And so, if the employer comes and presents this, we want to help you, I think people are going to be a lot more comfortable asking for accommodations.
Mm.
And I think that turns, right now, the system is very adversarial. And it needs to be more cooperative. It wasn't meant to be adversarial. It was meant to be collaborative brainstorming.
Well, I think the adversarial nature of it sometimes comes down to that HR's role, first and foremost, is to protect the organization. And I feel like, it's always been that way to a certain extent, but unfortunately, that can lead to an adversarial thing, especially if HR is viewing an interaction through the lens of, this is a risk to the business. This could cost somebody our job or cost our company money, right? Like, that's really where I think that comes down. So how can we break down the adversarial nature of that?
Yeah, I think one thing is just to point out the cost of replacing an employee. So the cost of replacing an employee is typically 30% of their salary. The average accommodation is under $500, right? So financially, accommodations make good sense. They're good business. Companies that excel at giving accommodations, they're 1.6 times more productive than companies without, or one time, that's the profit margin is 1.6 times higher. So I think, pointing out that accommodations are cheap, that professional consultation is also cheap, and that replacing an employee is very expensive. I think that's one part of it. I think people also need to understand the point of the ADA better. So I think a lot of people think that accommodations are favors or benefits, but really what they are is equalizing opportunity. The point of the ADA is that there are barriers in society that were not intentionally placed there, but we arrange society in a way that it works for the average body or the normal body and the normal mind. We didn't think to include everyone. There are people we're unintentionally excluding with policies that don't need to be that restrictive. It's just the way we've always done it. And so what the ADA says is those policies you have to modify. Not as a favor, not as charity, to equalize opportunity, because you have equally talented people with disabilities who aren't able to compete on an equal basis.
Kind of going back to the average Joe on the street, right? Like, somebody comes and here's what I will describe as a very common cycle that I see. It starts off where somebody has oftentimes a non-observable disability or chronic health condition of some kind. Say, for example, they have depression disorder, but they take medication, they take it for decades, and they're fine as they describe themselves. And then all of a sudden they have a traumatic life event or their body changes and their medications need to change. And then all of a sudden overnight, they can't even get out of bed the next day. Like it's that profound of a shift that happens. And so the first thing that they do is that they max out their PTO. And then almost immediately after that, they try to figure out how to request all the FMLA that they possibly can. Then they come back to work and maybe they've rubbed some feathers the wrong way. Maybe their boss at that point sees them as unreliable. And then finally, at the very end of all this, when they know that they're just about to be kicked out the door, that's when they raise their hand and say, I'd like to request a disability accommodation. And I think that at that point, it's too late. Like from the ADA's perspective, yes, you still have protections that are available, but think about the reputational harm that you've done to yourself at that point. I would love it for people to be able to self-advocate and self-disclose earlier in the process, because I can see a world where you go and you're starting a new job. You say, Karin, I'm so excited to be working for XYZ company. I think I'm going to make a great asset to your team. And you seem like such a great and understanding boss. By the way, I wanted to let you know that I personally experienced depression disorder. This has not been an issue for many, many years, and I'm regularly medicated. I also see a counselor on a regular basis. But I just wanted to give you a heads up in case my needs ever change over the course of time. And I would just ask that you would be understanding for me for if I need to change things later on down the line. So like for me, that feels like much more of a human way to go about it, but also kind of gives your manager a heads up. But going back to my question, I promise there is one in here. If you have the average Joe on the street that's watching this, and maybe they don't even know much about the ADA process, where would they go to get started and basically learn a little bit about this so that they can protect themselves and so that they can look out for future Miles or future Karin?
Yeah, I mean, so two places they can look. They can look to the EEOC. And again, I would encourage people look at the federal guidance that the EEOC issued and not the public guide, because it is more detailed. JAN, the Job Accommodations Network, they are a great source of information. But I guess I don't think you should have to disclose your personal details in order to be accommodated. And so rather than having the individual go in and say, I'd rather it come from HR saying, look, people have all different sorts of bodies and minds, and sometimes people need, I mean, and it's not just, I mean, so yes, I had to take time off for OCD and depression. I also fell and broke my back and had to take time. Anyone can fall and break their back. You know, things happen. Someone's mother can be sick. Someone's child can be sick, That's why the FMLA exists. And so, you know, if we were in a less stigmatizing society for mental illnesses, then I think what you're saying is great, but mental illnesses are still stigmatized. So I don't think it should be on the individual to have to say that. I think the workplace should have policies in place that allow for that sort of flexibility. And the thing about disability accommodations or, you know, assistive technology or accessibility in general, it helps everyone, So it's not just the person who might have a recurrence of depression, It's the person who might have a dying parent, the person who may have a very sick child, the person who falls and breaks their back, the person who has a heart attack, the person who needs cancer treatment, stuff happens in people's lives. The FMLA exists for a reason, and we should just be more open to people taking FMLA leaves.
And I think that brings up such an interesting question for managers too, because there's sometimes you go into HR and you go into management more specifically, because you trained for that particular role. But I think that a lot of times people kind of get thrust into these particular positions without really having a lot of formalized training. And so when somebody comes to them and they say, I have a disability accommodation request, they're going, wait, what do I do? What do I do? Where do I look? And I think this is challenging. Like, we have to do more education for the individual employees, but we also have to do more training for managers so that they're not scrambling and trying to make up an answer as they go. So where would they start? Like, somebody that has been newly thrust into a manager role, now they suddenly have 3 direct reports and they want to make sure that they do the right thing. Like, are they going to the same resources, or is there another kind of deeper dive that they should go to for this?
Yeah, with managers, it's a little bit hard. So officially, if your employer knows of your disability and knows that you are struggling, they have an obligation to offer you an accommodation. That said, like, if you haven't told them you have a disability, it can be discriminatory to ask you if you have a disability. So I think there's kind of a bind there with ordinary managers. I think just, training, right? You become a manager, you get training, here are the sorts of policies. And I would say, rather than training all of them in accessibility, just train them who to call, right? I think the more important thing is that the HR people who are handling accommodations either have training in accessibility or are specifically told, if this request, if you do not know the appropriate accommodation, here are the experts, you call them. Personally, I'd like it if every firm over, say, 50 people had specifically a disability coordinator, right?
Yeah.
So universities have them for students. They don't have them for faculty.
I mean, it's kind of ridiculous too that we have exemptions carved out for small businesses that you guys don't even need to follow the ADA, or if you're a small enough like religious organization, you don't need to worry about the ADA. And it's that kind of thing bothers me definitely.
Yeah, I mean, so small businesses, it's an undue burden question, but given that the burden is only $300 to $500, right, then the religious exemption is totally separate. There's a really fascinating history behind that. But yeah, I mean, just religious organizations are free to discriminate on the basis of disability. So the priesthood, the rabbihood, the imamhood, all of them, it is legal to discriminate against disability, but that's a separate issue.
Yeah, that is too bad. It's we try to make these systems, these ideas, like, simple, but then when we start having all these carve outs and exceptions, then it throws a whole kind of new monkey wrench into there. I guess the other question that I have, going back to managers, is I'm thinking back to my days working in retail, and I can only imagine all the different challenges that my managers did, where people are calling off for this, that, and the other reason. Maybe they're feeling sick that day. Maybe they just wanted to take the day off. Maybe they're going to their cousin's wedding and stuff, and they're balancing the needs of keeping the business open, alongside also disability accommodations requests. And a lot of times, like, a disability accommodation request may sound like just another excuse. So how do we shift mindsets so that managers that are overwhelmed with having to keep the wheels on the cart, so to speak, and keep it flowing and keep the business running, like, how do we balance that out to where they can separate those two in their mind a little bit?
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure that that's the right question. I mean, only because there is, you do not have to provide a reasonable accommodation if it would cause an undue burden, right? And so if you have to shut down your store because this employee keeps on, needs to take time, that would be an undue burden. I take it under the law. I should say I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not 100% positive about that. I mean, I guess maybe this is kind of like the point about the FMLA. Like, things happen. People get sick. People get the flu. People get COVID. People get burnt out and may need a day. Like, all of those are just human things. That's part of life. And part of being a people manager is understanding the things that happen to people, and dealing with that in a human and humane way. And so, I think I would like question some of the assumptions behind it. I've never had to manage a retail store. Yeah.
Yeah, it's scheduling is a bear. I've never managed it myself, but I saw those kind of stress that they took on. So part of it is like I definitely know where some of their frustration comes from, and I also know some of the um, how they get frustrated when something comes across as just like yet another excuse why somebody can't show up to work that day. And that's even retail. Well, you compare that with like fast food or something where the turnover is much higher. Like there's greater rates of absenteeism, things like that. That's tough. Like that really is tough to be able to separate those. So I want to kind of start to wrap up and kind of go back to the original question, and that is structure. We ourselves that have a pretty organic conversation about this, that, and the other. But in your mind, what would a perfect structure be to the ADA, and where should we add a little bit more steps in the process so that everybody can be more successful with ensuring that we all have access to accommodations?
Yeah, I'd say three things. So first has to do with the initiation of the process. So the process should start as soon as an employee informs you that they need an accommodation, whether they inform you orally or in writing. But the forms that you ask the employee to fill out and their medical professional, they should ask if you have suggestions for accommodations, but make clear that you do not have to propose an accommodation. You do not have to identify an accommodation beforehand. The purpose of the interactive process is to identify them. So that's one thing I would say. A second thing that I would say is to make clear that the ultimate responsibility to identify accommodations falls on the employer, so that if the employer is personally at a loss, it's their job to consult the appropriate expertise. I would also say that in terms of the documentation that you have to fill out, when you refuse a request, you should document why the request is refused. But I also think there should be a requirement to consider all accommodation categories. So, not just consider assistive technology, but so one accommodation is modifications to promotion and retention policies where those are exclusionary. That hardly ever gets considered. Transferring of marginal duties to someone else, not essential duties. That's an accommodation category, often doesn't get considered, right? So, I think the same accommodations, things like dictation software, things like quiet spaces, adaptive technology, right? Those things employers seem comfortable with. The other accommodation categories tend not to be considered. So a requirement to consider every accommodation category and to consult an expert before you say that no reasonable accommodation is possible.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, Karin, as we wrap up for the day, again, I appreciate your insights into adding a little bit more structure into the accommodations process. Tell me a little bit more about what's going on with you, what you're working on, and how people can connect with you.
Okay. The easiest way to connect with me is LinkedIn. So that is an easy question to answer. What is going on with me? So I just finished a draft of this law review article. It is now with my partner, who is going over the legal stuff to make sure I'm not a lawyer, he is, to make sure I got the law correctly. I'm also working on a paper on the concept of disability, so a philosophy paper. Is one of the things I'm working on now, and then also working on another disability studies paper, talking about my experiences of ableism. And then Coming up in March, I'll be speaking on the ADA to the Pacific ADA conference. And then I will be speaking about ableism in higher education at NASPA, the National Association of Student Professional Administrators, I believe, in June.
That's awesome. Well, we'll be on the lookout for that. I look forward to hearing what's next from you, Karin. And in the meantime, too, I will also draw a link to our original interview where Karin talks a little bit more extensively about her particular experiences with obsessive compulsive disorder and further insights into things like ableism as well. Karin, thank you very much for coming on today. It's been a pleasure reconnecting with you and chatting with you and talking a little bit more about adding structure into the ADA accommodations process. I also do want to thank everybody that did join us live. Until next time, this has been Miles from Peak